The spotlight burns hot against my face as I step onto the stage at the Global Leadership Summit in Geneva. 2,500 faces look up at me from the darkened auditorium, their collective breath held in anticipation. The teleprompter glows with my opening words, but I don't need it. These words have lived in my heart for 3 years, crystallizing during countless sleepless nights when doubt whispered that I'd never be good enough, that my voice would never matter. Good evening, I begin, my accent, the same one they once mocked, now carrying across the vast space with crystalline clarity. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm here to talk about the power of finding your authentic voice in a world that tells you to be silent. The applause is thunderous, washing over me like a warm tide. But even as I smile and wait for it to subside, my mind drifts to that conference room 3 years ago, where everything changed, where I finally understood that some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, they're meant to be burned. 3 years earlier, I was still Elena Rodriguez Martinez, trapped in a suffocating corporate cage at Morrison and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious consulting firms. I'd been there for 4 years, working 16-hour days, sacrificing weekends, and swallowing every slight with the desperate hope that dedication would eventually earn me respect. It never did. The morning it all began to unravel started like any other. I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., an hour before anyone else, as was my habit. I used this quiet time to prepare for meetings, review presentations, and practice my English pronunciation, something I'd been doing religiously since moving from Colombia 8 years prior. My accent had softened considerably over the years, but it remained, a subtle musicality that marked me as different in rooms full of people who'd never had to translate their thoughts before speaking them. "Elena, conference room 3 in 10 minutes, barked James Morrison, the founding partner's son and my direct supervisor. At 32, James had inherited his position the way some people inherit eye color, effortlessly and without question. He'd never worked anywhere else, never struggled for anything, never had to prove his worth beyond the accident of his birth. I gathered my materials for the monthly strategy meeting, the same presentation I'd been refining for weeks. Morrison and Associates was pitching a major contract with a European telecommunications company, and I'd been the lead researcher, spending countless hours analyzing market trends, competitor strategies, and cultural considerations for expanding into Latin American markets. My bilingual skills and cultural insight had made me invaluable to the project, though the credit always seemed to flow upward to James and his team of Ivy League contemporaries. The conference room was already full when I arrived. James sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by his usual cronies, Bradley from Harvard, Connor from Yale, and Marcus from Princeton. They wore their pedigrees like armor, each tie and cufflink a small declaration of belonging I could never quite achieve, no matter how many late nights I worked or how perfectly I prepared my presentations. "All right, team," James began, not bothering to look up from his phone. "Elena's going to walk us through her research on the Latin American expansion strategy." I stood, smoothing my blazer, a carefully chosen piece that had cost me 2 weeks' worth of lunches, but looked appropriately expensive next to their effortless designer wear. My slides were immaculate, my research thorough, my recommendations sound. I'd spent the previous evening practicing my delivery, recording myself to catch any pronunciation stumbles that might undermine my credibility. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice steady and professional. "Based on my analysis of the telecommunications market in Latin America, I believe we have a significant opportunity to position ourselves as the primary consultants for European companies looking to expand into this region." I clicked to my first slide, which showed market projections and growth potential. The telecommunications sector in Latin America is experiencing unprecedented growth, with annual increases of 15 to 20% in most major markets. However, European companies have struggled to establish footing due to cultural and linguistic barriers that we are uniquely positioned to address. Bradley shifted in his chair, making a show of checking his watch. Connor was openly scrolling through his phone. Marcus doodled in his notebook, occasionally glancing up with the bored expression of someone forced to endure a necessary but tedious task. Only James paid attention, but his focus felt predatory rather than professional. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching me with the calculating gaze of someone looking for weaknesses to exploit. I continued through my presentation, detailing competitive advantages, potential challenges, and my recommended approach for the upcoming client pitch. My research was solid. I'd conducted interviews with local business leaders, analyzed economic reports, and even reached out to contacts from my university days in Bogota to gather insider perspectives that no American consulting firm could access. In conclusion, I said, advancing to my final slide, I recommend we emphasize our cultural competency and bilingual capabilities as our primary differentiator. The client has specifically mentioned their previous struggles with American firms who failed to understand the nuances of doing business in Latin America. I clicked off the presentation and looked around the room, expecting questions or discussion. Instead, I found barely concealed smirks and exchanged glances. "Well," James said finally, his tone dripping with condescension, "that was certainly informative." Bradley laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that made my stomach clench. "I have to say, Elena, listening to you present always makes me feel like I'm watching Telemundo. Very authentic." The room erupted in chuckles. Connor added, "Maybe we should subtitle the client presentation for clarity," which earned another round of laughter. My face burned with humiliation, but I forced myself to remain composed. This wasn't the first time they'd made comments about my accent, my pronunciation, my exotic perspective. I'd learned to smile and pretend their remarks were good-natured teasing rather than the systematic erosion of my professional credibility. "I think Elena's research is comprehensive," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "The client specifically requested someone with Latin American expertise." "Oh, we're not questioning your research," Marcus chimed in, leaning forward with mock sincerity. "It's just that when we're presenting it to European executives, we might want someone who sounds a bit more polished. Someone who doesn't make analysis sound like Annalise." He dragged out the word in a cruel mockery of my pronunciation, and the room dissolved into renewed laughter. James didn't participate, but he didn't stop it either. He simply watched with that calculating expression as if cataloging my reaction for future use. I gathered my materials with shaking hands, my carefully rehearsed confidence crumbling like tissue paper in the rain. I'll revise the presentation based on your feedback," I whispered. "Actually," James said, his voice cutting through the lingering chuckles, "I think it might be better if Bradley takes the lead on the client presentation. Elena, you can provide support materials, but we need someone who can really connect with the European executives on their level." The words hit me like a physical blow. 4 months of work, countless hours of research, insights that only I could provide, all of it dismissed because my voice carried the rhythm of my homeland. I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak without my voice breaking. As I walked back to my cubicle, their laughter followed me down the hallway. I heard Bradley's voice carrying over the others. "Maybe we should get her some accent reduction therapy as a Christmas bonus." I made it to my desk before the tears came. 36 years old, a master's degree from Northwestern, 8 years of perfect performance reviews. And I was still the outsider whose voice wasn't good enough, whose perspective was valuable only when filtered through someone else's presentation. That night, I sat in my tiny studio apartment, staring at my reflection in the dark window. My accent wasn't an accident or a flaw. It was part of my story, part of the journey that had brought me from a small town outside Bogota to a corner office in downtown Chicago. It represented my grandmother's bedtime stories, my mother's lullabies, the passionate debates with my university friends about politics and philosophy and dreams that seemed too big for the world we knew. But in conference room 3 at Morrison and Associates, my accent was just another barrier to overcome. Another way I didn't quite fit into their narrow definition of professional excellence. I pulled out my laptop and began researching something I'd been avoiding for months: options for leaving Morrison and Associates. My savings account was modest, my network limited, and my confidence shattered. But somewhere in the depths of my humiliation, a small spark of anger began to glow. Not the explosive rage that burns out quickly, but the steady, determined flame that builds empires and topples kingdoms. The next morning brought the incident that would finally shatter my tolerance for their cruelty. I arrived at the office to find my desk covered with printouts, articles about accent reduction, speech therapy advertisements, and language learning apps. At the center of the pile was a gift card to a local speech therapist with a sticky note attached. From your friends at M&A, consider it an investment in your future. B. Bradley stood by the coffee machine, watching my reaction with the delighted expression of someone who'd executed a particularly clever practical joke. Connor and Marcus flanked him, barely containing their amusement. "Morning, Elena," Bradley called out with false cheer. "Thought you might appreciate some professional development resources." I stared at the papers scattered across my workspace, each one a small knife twist in an already open wound. The speech therapy brochure promised to eliminate foreign accents for professional success. The newspaper clipping highlighted a local woman who'd overcome her linguistic barriers to achieve executive status. The gift card, a $100 investment in erasing the parts of myself that made me different. "This is," I began, then stopped. My voice was shaking, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Helpful?" Bradley suggested, his grin widening. "We're just looking out for you, Elena. In this business, image is everything. Sometimes we all need a little help reaching our potential." Marcus nodded sagely. "It's not personal, it's just business. Clients respond better to certain presentations." I gathered the papers into a neat pile, my movements mechanical and precise. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Instead, they moved with the crystalline clarity that comes from absolute certainty. The moment when all doubt disappears and you finally understand exactly what you need to do. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice steady as stone. "This is very thoughtful." They exchanged glances, clearly surprised by my calm response. They'd expected tears, maybe an outburst, definitely some reaction they could use to further undermine my professional standing. Instead, I walked to the supply closet, retrieved a box, and began clearing out my desk. "Elena?" Bradley's voice had lost its mocking edge, replaced by confusion. "What are you doing?" I continued packing, each item placed carefully in the box. 4 years of accumulated work life. A small cactus my sister had given me, the Northwestern coffee mug from my graduation, pens and notebooks filled with ideas that would never see the light of day in this place. "Elena." This time it was Connor, his voice uncertain. "Come on, it was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." I looked up at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. He was 28 years old, still living on his trust fund, still coasting on connections made in his fraternity house. He'd never been the only person in a room who looked like him, never translated his thoughts before speaking, never had to prove his worth beyond the accident of his birth. "It wasn't a joke," I said simply, "and I'm not being sensitive." James appeared at his office door, drawn by the commotion. "Elena, what's going on here?" I stood up, box in my arms, and walked toward his office. The others followed, creating a small parade of confusion and growing concern. "I'm resigning," I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet office. "Effective immediately." James's face went through several rapid changes. Surprise, then calculation, then something approaching panic. "Elena, let's discuss this in my office. I'm sure we can work out whatever misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I interrupted, setting my box down on his desk. "I'm done." I reached into my purse and pulled out a carefully folded letter. My resignation, typed the night before in a moment of prophetic clarity. I'd somehow known this morning would bring the final straw, the last humiliation that would finally unlock the courage I'd been hoarding for years. "Helena, be reasonable," James said, his tone shifting to that of a parent talking to a difficult child. "You're emotional right now. Take the day off, think about it, and we'll talk tomorrow." "I've been thinking about it for 4 years," I replied, "and I'm not emotional. I'm finally clear." I walked to his filing cabinet and retrieved my personal files, copies of my research, my client correspondence, my performance reviews documenting 4 years of exemplary work that had somehow never translated into respect or advancement. "You can't just leave," Bradley protested. "You have responsibilities. The Latin American project will be handled by someone who sounds more professional," I finished for him. "Someone who can really connect with European executives on their level." The words, his words from yesterday's meeting, hung in the air like an accusation. Bradley's face reddened as he realized I was using his own justification against him. "Elena, let's be practical here," James said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used with difficult clients. "You're upset about some office banter. It happens to everyone. That's no reason to throw away a promising career." I turned to face him fully, my expression calm and direct. "James, in 4 years, I've brought in $12 million in new business. I've worked more weekends than I've had off. I've never missed a deadline, never failed to deliver, never given you anything less than my absolute best." He nodded eagerly. "Exactly, which is why—" "And in 4 years," I continued, "I've never been promoted, never been given credit for my work in client meetings, and never been treated as anything more than a research assistant with useful cultural connections. That's not. Yesterday, you gave my presentation to Bradley because my accent wasn't professional enough. This morning, your team gave me gift cards for speech therapy because my voice doesn't fit your image requirements." I gestured toward the printouts still scattered on my desk. "This isn't office banter, James. This is systematic discrimination dressed up as helpful feedback." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in James's head as he calculated the legal implications of my accusations, the potential HR nightmare, the uncomfortable questions that might arise if I chose to pursue formal complaints. "I'm sure we can address any concerns you have about workplace culture," he said carefully. "Perhaps some sensitivity training, some policy adjustments." "I'm sure you can," I agreed, "but not with me. I'm done being the cultural consultant who's not cultured enough, the expert who's not polished enough, the colleague who's valuable enough to exploit but not enough to respect." I picked up my box and walked toward the door. The entire office had gone silent, my colleagues pretending to work while straining to catch every word of this unprecedented drama. "Elena," James called out as I reached the doorway, "you're making a mistake. You'll never find another position like this. Consulting firms talk to each other. If you leave this way, you'll be blacklisted." I turned back one final time, memorizing their faces. James with his calculated concern, Bradley with his confused indignation, Connor and Marcus with their matching expressions of uncomfortable guilt. These men who had shaped my professional life, who had made me question my worth, who had convinced me that my voice was something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. "Then I guess I'll have to create my own opportunities," I said, "in a place where my voice is an asset, not a liability." I walked out of Morrison and Associates for the last time, carrying nothing but a cardboard box and a fierce determination to prove that their narrow definition of success was just one option among many. The elevator doors closed behind me, sealing off that chapter of my life with mechanical finality. As I descended toward the lobby, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the exhilarating lightness of absolute freedom. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open, staring at a blank document titled, "What's Next?" The cursor blinked expectantly, waiting for me to fill the emptiness with purpose and direction. The practical voice in my head, the one that had kept me trapped at Morrison and Associates for 4 years, whispered its familiar warnings. No job, limited savings, a potentially tainted reputation in the tight-knit Chicago consulting world. I was 36 years old, starting over in an economy that favored youth and connections I'd never been able to cultivate. But underneath the practical concerns was something else, a singing clarity that felt like coming home after years of exile. For the first time in my adult life, I was accountable only to myself. My voice, my accent, my perspective, all the things they'd tried to diminish, were now mine to define and deploy as I saw fit. I began typing. Elena Vasquez Communications Consulting. The name appeared on the screen, bold and unapologetic. Not Rodriguez Martinez, the hyphenated compromise I'd adopted to maintain some connection to my father's more American-sounding surname. Just Vasquez, my mother's name, the one that carried the strength of 5 generations of women who'd refused to be silenced. Over the next 3 weeks, I threw myself into building something entirely new. I created a website highlighting my expertise in cross-cultural communications, my bilingual capabilities, and my deep understanding of Latin American markets. Instead of hiding my accent, I made it central to my brand, the authentic voice that could bridge cultural divides and unlock opportunities other consultants couldn't access. I reached out to my network from Northwestern, to former colleagues who'd left Morrison and Associates, to the contacts I'd made in my research for the Latin American project. Slowly, carefully, I began to build a foundation for something that was entirely mine. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Maria Santos, a professor at Northwestern's business school, called me on a Tuesday morning in November. "Elena," she said, her own accent carrying traces of her Puerto Rican heritage, "I've been following your transition from M&A. I have a proposition that might interest you." Maria had been selected to organize a panel on global communications for the Midwest Business Leadership Conference, a prestigious event that drew executives from across the region. The previous year's panel had been criticized for its lack of diversity and cultural perspective. "I need a panelist who can speak authentically about the challenges of cross-cultural communication in American business," she explained. "Someone who's lived it, not just studied it. Your name keeps coming up in my conversations with alumni." My first instinct was panic. Speaking to a room full of executives, many of whom might be exactly like the men I'd left behind at Morrison and Associates, felt like walking voluntarily into the lion's den. "I don't know, Maria," I hedged. "I'm still building my practice. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of visibility." "Elena," she said gently, "I've known you since you were my student 8 years ago. You were never the loudest voice in class, but you were always the most thoughtful. And your accent? It's not a weakness. It's evidence of your courage, your adaptability, your commitment to growth. The business world needs to hear that perspective." I stared out my apartment window at the gray November sky, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk below. Each of them had their own story, their own challenges, their own moments of choosing between safety and growth. "What would I talk about?" I asked. "Whatever you want," Maria replied. "But I suspect you have some thoughts about what happens when businesses fail to recognize the value of diverse perspectives." That night, I began crafting my first public presentation since leaving Morrison and Associates. But this time, there was no James to please, no Bradley to appease, no expectations to manage beyond my own commitment to truth. I wrote about the morning I found speech therapy brochures on my desk. I wrote about the clients who'd specifically requested my cultural insight, only to have it filtered through other people's presentations. I wrote about the cost of making people comfortable with their own prejudices instead of challenging them to grow. Most importantly, I wrote about the power of authentic voice, not just in the literal sense of accent and pronunciation, but in the deeper sense of bringing your whole self to your work, your relationships, your contribution to the world. The Midwest Business Leadership Conference was held at the Palmer House in downtown Chicago, just 6 blocks from the Morrison and Associates offices. As I walked into the grand ballroom where my panel would be held, I caught a glimpse of familiar faces in the registration area. James Morrison stood near the coffee station, schmoozing with potential clients in his perfectly tailored suit. Our eyes met across the crowded lobby. His expression shifted from polite conference smile to shocked recognition to something approaching alarm. I nodded politely and continued toward the green room, carrying myself with the quiet confidence I'd been building over the past 3 months. The panel went better than I dared hope. My co-panelists, a marketing executive from Detroit and a communications director from Milwaukee, were thoughtful and engaged. The moderator asked insightful questions that allowed each of us to showcase our expertise. When it came time for my portion, I spoke about the hidden costs of cultural homogeneity in business leadership. I shared statistics about companies that had failed in international markets due to cultural misunderstandings and contrasted them with organizations that had thrived by embracing diverse perspectives. "The accent you hear when I speak," I said to the audience of 300 executives, "represents 8 years of English as a second language, 15 years of navigating American business culture, and 36 years of bridging different worlds. When you hear an accent, you're not hearing a limitation, you're hearing evidence of someone's courage, adaptability, and global perspective." The applause was warm and sustained. During the Quanda, several audience members asked for my contact information. A technology executive from Milwaukee wanted to discuss consulting opportunities for their Latin American expansion. A manufacturing CEO from Indianapolis asked about communication training for their diverse workforce. As the session ended, I gathered my materials with a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. This was what professional respect felt like. Not the grudging acknowledgement I'd received at Morrison and Associates, but genuine appreciation for the unique value I brought to the conversation. Elena, I turned to find James Morrison standing behind me, his expression uncertain and slightly desperate. Up close, he looked older than I remembered, more worn around the edges. The confidence he'd projected in our conference room seemed diminished in this larger arena. James, I said calmly, I didn't expect to see you here. I caught your presentation, he said, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before, something approaching respect. It was impressive, very professional. I waited for him to continue, refusing to fill the awkward silence with small talk or reassurance. Listen, he said finally, I think there might have been some misunderstandings about your departure, some miscommunications about your role and your contributions to the firm. I don't think there were any misunderstandings, I replied evenly. I think everyone communicated quite clearly. His face reddened slightly. Elena, what I'm trying to say is that we've been reassessing our approach to the Latin American project. Bradley's presentation to the European client, it didn't go as well as we'd hoped. They were looking for more cultural insight, more authentic perspective. I nodded politely, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in my eyes. I see. We'd like to discuss bringing you back, he continued, his words coming faster now. As a senior consultant this time. Your own office, your own projects, full credit for your work. We realize we may have underutilized your expertise. The offer hung in the air between us like a poorly timed joke. 6 months ago, it would have been everything I'd dreamed of. Recognition, respect, the validation I'd been seeking for 4 years. Now it felt like an insult wrapped in flattery. That's generous, I said, my voice carrying no trace of the emotions churning beneath the surface. But I'm not interested. James's expression shifted to confusion, then to something approaching panic. Elena, be practical. You can't make a living giving conference presentations. Consulting is a relationship business, and we have the established client base, the infrastructure, the reputation. The same reputation that includes systematic discrimination against employees who don't fit your cultural mold? I interrupted, my voice still calm, but carrying an edge of steel. The same infrastructure that supports managers who mock their colleagues' accents and suggest speech therapy as professional development? That was just office culture. You know, Bradley doesn't mean anything by his jokes. He's actually a big supporter of diversity. James, I said, cutting him off. 3 months ago, you told me I'd never find another position like the one I had at your firm. You said consulting firms talk to each other, that I'd be blacklisted if I left the way I did. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I was frustrated. I didn't mean. You meant every word, I replied. And you were wrong. Not about the challenges, building my own practice has been difficult, but about my options. You assumed that your approval was the only path to success, that your definition of professional excellence was the only one that mattered. I gestured toward the ballroom where conference attendees were still networking and exchanging business cards. 3 months out of your firm, and I'm being asked to consult on international expansion projects, to design communication training programs, to speak at conferences about topics I'm actually qualified to address. My accent isn't a liability in this world. It's an asset that sets me apart from every other consultant who sounds exactly like you. James opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. You want to know the real irony? That European telecommunications client you were so worried about impressing? They specifically requested a consultant with authentic Latin American experience for their next phase of expansion. Not someone who sounds professional enough to work with Europeans, but someone who actually understands the markets they're trying to enter. His face went pale. How do you? Because they called me yesterday, I said simply. Dr. Santos gave them my contact information after my presentation today. They want to discuss a 6-month contract that's worth more than my annual salary at Morrison and Associates. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of irony and consequence. James Morrison, who had spent years convincing me that my voice wasn't good enough for his clients, now faced the reality that those same clients were specifically seeking the authenticity he'd tried to train out of me. Elena, he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I think we made some mistakes in how we handled your time with us. If you'd consider coming back, even as an independent contractor, we could structure something that gives you the autonomy and recognition you deserve." "You're right," I said. "You did make mistakes, but they weren't mistakes, James. They were choices. Every time you dismissed my ideas, every time you let Bradley mock my accent, every time you gave my work to someone else because they sounded more professional, those were deliberate choices that reflected your values and your vision of what success looks like." I picked up my briefcase and prepared to leave. "I'm building something different now, something where diverse voices aren't just tolerated, they're celebrated, something where authenticity is seen as strength, not weakness, something where my accent is exactly what makes me valuable, not what holds me back." As I walked away, I heard him call out one last time, "Elena, you're making a mistake. You'll never build something as substantial as what we can offer you." I turned back briefly, meeting his eyes with the calm certainty that had carried me through the past 3 months. "You're right about one thing, James. I'll never build something like Morrison and Associates. I'll build something better." The next 18 months passed in a blur of growth, challenge, and validation I'd never experienced in the corporate world. Elena Vasquez Communications became the go-to firm for companies serious about expanding into Latin American markets or improving their cross-cultural communication capabilities. My client roster grew to include technology companies, manufacturing firms, and consulting agencies, many of them competitors of Morrison and Associates who had poached opportunities by offering what James's firm couldn't: authentic cultural insight combined with strategic business acumen. The telecommunications contract led to 3 more European clients, each of them specifically requesting my services based on recommendations from previous engagements. My accent, far from being a liability, became my calling card, proof of the authentic global perspective they couldn't find in traditional American consulting firms. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Santos recommended me for something I'd never imagined: the keynote speaker position for the International Business Communications Summit in Miami. "Elena," she said during our phone conversation, "this is a big opportunity. 500 international executives, global media coverage, the kind of platform that can establish you as a thought leader in this field." I stared at my calendar, mentally calculating the preparation time, the travel costs, the risk of exposing myself to that level of scrutiny. The frightened voice that had once kept me trapped at Morrison and Associates whispered its familiar warnings about reaching too high, about setting myself up for failure. But the voice that had carried me out of that conference room, the one that insisted my perspective mattered, spoke louder. "What's the topic?" I asked. "The future of global leadership, embracing authentic voice in international business," Maria replied. "They want someone who can speak from personal experience about overcoming cultural barriers in American business, someone who's built something significant from the ground up." The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, I'd been told my voice wasn't professional enough for a client presentation. Now I was being asked to address an international audience about the power of authentic communication. I spent 6 weeks crafting my keynote, drawing not just from my business experience, but from the deeper story of transformation that had brought me to this moment. The presentation became a manifesto about the hidden costs of cultural conformity and the untapped potential that organizations miss when they prioritize comfort over authenticity. The Miami conference was held at the Fontainebleau, a massive Art Deco hotel that sprawled along the beach like a monument to ambition and success. As I checked in, I felt the familiar flutter of nervousness, but underneath it was something stronger: the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your message matters. The night before my keynote, I sat on my hotel room balcony, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I'd been a senior research analyst who couldn't get credit for her own presentations. Tomorrow, I would address 500 international business leaders about the future of global communication. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw your name in the conference program. Looking forward to your presentation. Bradley Chen." Bradley. Of all the people from my past life at Morrison and Associates, he was the last person I'd expected to reach out. My first instinct was to ignore the message, but curiosity won out. I called the number. "Elena?" His voice was the same, but something in his tone was different, less cocky, more tentative. "Hello, Bradley," I said neutrally. "I can't believe you're keynoting the IBC summit," he said. That's incredible. Really impressive." I waited for the other shoe to drop, for the subtle dig or backhanded compliment that would remind me why I'd left Morrison and Associates in the first place. Instead, he said, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air, unexpected and strangely anticlimactic. I'd imagined this conversation dozens of times over the past 3 years, crafting perfect responses to the various ways he might try to minimize his behavior or justify his actions. I'd never imagined him leading with accountability. "Go on," I said. "The speech therapy thing," he said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "The comments about your accent, the way I treated you. It was wrong, not just unprofessional, wrong, and I'm sorry." I sat in the silence that followed, processing the apology I'd never expected to receive. Part of me wanted to hang up, to preserve the clean narrative of villains and vindication that had fueled my transformation. But the larger part, the part that had learned to embrace complexity and nuance, recognized that real growth required engaging with uncomfortable truths. "What changed?" I asked. "A lot of things," he admitted, "partly watching your success from the outside. Partly working with some new colleagues who called me out on behavior I thought was just normal office banter. Partly growing up, I guess." He paused, then continued more hesitantly. "My sister started dating a guy from Guatemala last year. Really smart guy, MBA from Wharton, working in international finance. But his accent is pretty thick, and I watched how people responded to him in professional settings. Watched him deal with the same kind of casual dismissal we put you through." "And?" I prompted. "And I realized I was part of the problem," he said simply. "I was part of a system that made talented people feel like they had to change fundamental parts of themselves to be taken seriously. That's not just wrong, it's stupid. It's wasteful." I found myself nodding, even though he couldn't see me. This was the conversation I'd wanted to have 3 years ago, when the wounds were fresh and the injustice felt overwhelming. Now, with distance and success providing perspective, I could appreciate the courage it took for him to make this call. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "I really do." "Ellie Naya," he said, "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but things have changed at Morrison and Associates. James brought in a new diversity consultant, implemented some training programs, changed some policies around presentation assignments and client relationships." "That's good," I said, and meant it. Change usually happens slowly in organizations like that. "The thing is," he continued, "we've lost 3 major international contracts in the past year because we couldn't provide the kind of cultural insight clients are looking for. The telecommunications company, a manufacturing firm looking to expand into Mexico, a tech startup planning operations in Argentina. All of them went with consultants who could offer authentic regional expertise." I didn't respond, sensing he had more to say. "James has been talking about reaching out to you," he said, "not to try to bring you back. He knows that ship has sailed, but to see if there might be opportunities for collaboration. Referrals, maybe, or joint ventures where your expertise would complement our traditional services." The suggestion was shrewd, I had to admit. Rather than trying to recreate the cultural insight they'd lost when I left, they were acknowledging that my independent practice had become valuable enough to partner with rather than compete against. "That's an interesting proposition," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure why James hasn't approached me directly." Bradley laughed, a sound that held no trace of the mocking edge I remembered. "Because he's embarrassed. Because he knows he treated you badly and doesn't know how to fix it. Because his pride won't let him admit that letting you go was the biggest strategic mistake the firm has made in years." "And you think I should make it easy for him?" I asked. "I think you should do whatever serves your business best," he replied. "But I also think there might be value in considering collaboration with people who've learned from their mistakes, even if they learned the hard way." After we hung up, I sat on the balcony for another hour, processing the conversation and its implications. The old Elena, the one who'd spent 4 years trying to earn approval from men who would never see her as an equal, might have been tempted to accept their overtures as validation, proof that she'd finally achieved the success they'd claimed was impossible. But the Elena who would take the stage tomorrow had learned to value her independence more than their approval. Collaboration would only make sense if it served her goals, her clients, and her vision of what authentic business success looked like. The next morning dawned clear and warm, with the kind of crystalline light that makes everything seem possible. I dressed carefully, a navy blue suit that conveyed authority without hiding my personality, jewelry that celebrated my heritage rather than minimizing it, hairstyled to frame my face rather than conform to someone else's standard of professionalism. As I walked onto the stage at the Fontainebleau, 500 faces looked up at me from the darkened ballroom. This time, there was no Bradley to mock my pronunciation, no James to second-guess my credibility, no conference room full of people who saw my accent as something to be fixed rather than celebrated. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "My name is Elena Vasquez, and 3 years ago, a colleague told me I sounded like Telemundo and suggested I get speech therapy to sound more professional." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the audience. I smiled and continued. "Today, I want to talk about what happens when organizations mistake conformity for competence, when they prioritize comfort over capability, and when they fail to recognize that authentic voice, including accented voice, is often exactly what their clients are looking for." Over the next 45 minutes, I shared my story with unflinching honesty. I talked about the gift cards for speech therapy, the systematic exclusion from client presentations, the way my expertise had been filtered through other people's voices to make it more palatable for executives who looked like the men who'd tried to change me. But I also talked about the power of liberation, the moment when you stop seeking approval from people who will never see your worth and start building something that celebrates exactly who you are. I shared statistics about the business value of diverse perspectives, case studies of companies that had succeeded by embracing authentic global voices, and practical strategies for creating truly inclusive professional environments. The response was electric. During the Quanda, executives lined up at microphones to ask questions, share their own experiences, and request my contact information. Several mentioned specific challenges their organizations faced with international expansion, cross-cultural communication, and inclusive leadership development. As I left the stage, I felt the same exhilarating lightness I'd experienced walking out of Morrison & Associates 3 years earlier. But this time, it wasn't the freedom of escape. It was the satisfaction of having found my authentic voice and used it to contribute something meaningful to the world. The reception following my keynote was a networking paradise. I collected business cards from executives representing industries I'd never imagined entering, geographic markets I'd never considered exploring, and collaboration opportunities that could transform my practice from a successful consultancy into a platform for global impact. "Elena!" I turned to find a familiar face approaching through the crowd, Dr. Maria Santos, beaming with pride and satisfaction. "That was extraordinary," she said, pulling me into a warm embrace. "I've been watching the response, and I think you've just established yourself as the definitive voice on authentic leadership in global business." "It feels surreal," I admitted. 3 years ago, I was convinced my career was over. Now I'm being approached about opportunities I never dreamed were possible. "That's what happens when you stop letting other people define your limitations," Maria replied. "When you embrace what makes you different instead of trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for you." And as if summoned by our conversation about transformation, I spotted a familiar figure across the room. James Morrison stood near the bar, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a gathering where he was no longer the most important person in the room. Our eyes met across the crowded reception area. For a moment, I saw the same calculating expression I remembered from Conference Room 3, the look of someone trying to figure out how to turn a situation to his advantage. But this time, the power dynamic was entirely different. He approached slowly as if uncertain of his welcome. "Elena," he said, extending his hand with a careful formality. "Congratulations on your keynote. It was very impactful." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the handshake with professional courtesy but no warmth. "I was hoping we might have a chance to talk," he continued, "about potential collaboration opportunities between our firms." I studied his face, noting the signs of strain around his eyes, the slightly desperate edge to his professional smile. Bradley had been right about Morrison and Associates' recent struggles, and it showed in James's demeanor. "I'm always open to discussing mutually beneficial partnerships," I said neutrally, though I should mention that my client roster is quite full at the moment. "Of course," he said quickly. "I wouldn't expect you to have availability for new projects, but I was thinking more about referral relationships. Maybe joint proposals for larger international engagements where our traditional services could complement your cultural expertise." The proposal was reasonable, even attractive from a business perspective. Morrison and Associates still had substantial resources, established client relationships, and operational capabilities that could amplify the impact of my specialized services. But as I looked at James, this man who had spent years convincing me that my voice wasn't good enough for his clients, I realized that the opportunity to work together was less important than the acknowledgement implicit in his request. He wasn't just asking for collaboration, he was admitting that his firm's definition of professional excellence had been wrong, that the very qualities he'd tried to diminish were now essential to his business success. "That's an interesting proposition," I said. "Why don't you have your office send me a formal proposal outlining what kind of partnership you have in mind? I'll review it and get back to you." Relief flooded his expression. "Absolutely, I'll have our business development team put together something comprehensive for your consideration." As he walked away, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with potential revenue or business expansion. 3 years ago, James Morrison had told me I'd never find another position like the one I'd had at his firm. Now he was asking me to consider working with him again, not as an employee seeking his approval, but as an independent professional whose expertise he needed. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Elena Rodriguez Martinez, the research analyst who apologized for her accent and grateful for any recognition she received. I was Elena Vasquez, international communications consultant, keynote speaker, and authentic voice in a world that was finally ready to listen. 6 months later, I stood in my new office in downtown Miami, looking out at Biscayne Bay and reviewing the morning's schedule. Elena Vasquez Communications had grown from a one-person consultancy to a firm with 4 employees, offices in Miami and Chicago, and a client roster that spanned 3 continents. The morning's first call was with a technology startup planning expansion into Colombia, a project that had come through the referral partnership I'd eventually established with Morrison and Associates. The arrangement was working well for both firms. They provided operational support and traditional consulting services, while I brought the cultural insight and authentic regional expertise their clients demanded. James had visited the Miami office the previous month to discuss expanding our collaboration. The conversation had been professional and productive, marked by a mutual respect that would have been impossible during my years as his employee. He no longer questioned my expertise or suggested ways I might make my perspective more palatable for his clients. Instead, he deferred to my judgment on cultural and communication strategies, acknowledging that my authentic voice was exactly what distinguished our joint proposals from the competition. Bradley had also made the transition from former tormentor to genuine colleague. His work on our shared projects was thorough and thoughtful, and he'd become an effective advocate for inclusive communication practices within Morrison and Associates. The change seemed authentic, not just professional repositioning, but genuine personal growth that had emerged from confronting the consequences of his previous behavior. My second call of the day was with the International Business Communications Summit Planning Committee. They'd asked me to return as next year's opening keynote speaker, with the option to design a full day of workshops on authentic leadership development. The platform would allow me to reach an even broader audience with the message that had transformed my own life: that success comes not from conforming to others' expectations, but from embracing and leveraging what makes you uniquely valuable. As I prepared for the day's final call, a consultation with a European consulting firm looking to establish operations in Latin America, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd walked out of Morrison and Associates, carrying nothing but a cardboard box and a fierce determination to prove that their narrow definition of success was just one option among many. I'd built something better, not just a more successful business, but a more authentic life. A professional identity that celebrated rather than minimized my background, my perspective, my voice. a platform from which I could help other professionals navigate the complex terrain of cultural authenticity in global business. The woman who'd been told she sounded like Telemundo was now being sought out specifically for the authority and authenticity that accent represented. The voice they'd tried to change had become my greatest professional asset. Proof that true success comes not from fitting into existing molds, but from creating new ones that honor the full range of human experience and expertise. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown international number. Saw your TED Talk online. Starting my own practice after years of being told to minimize my accent. Thank you for showing what's possible. Sarah Chen, Singapore. I smiled as I typed my response. Your accent is evidence of your courage and global perspective. The world needs what you have to offer. Build something that celebrates exactly who you are. The circle was complete. 3 years ago, I'd been the recipient of casual cruelty disguised as professional development. Today, I was the voice encouraging others to reject the false choice between authenticity and success, to build careers that honored rather than erased the qualities that made them unique. They had mocked my accent, suggesting I change the very thing that connected me to my heritage, my journey, my identity. Instead, I had quietly transformed that supposed weakness into my greatest strength, building an international platform from which that same accent now reached audiences around the world. And they had watched, just as the title promised, first with confusion, then with grudging respect, finally with the recognition that their definition of professional excellence had been too narrow to contain the full spectrum of global leadership. The phone rang, and I answered in the voice that had carried me from humiliation to triumph, from conformity to authenticity, from seeking their approval to earning international recognition for exactly who I was meant to be. Elena Vasquez Communications, I said, my accent clear and strong, carrying across the ocean to connect with yet another client who valued precisely what they had once mocked. How can I help you succeed?